Picture this, it's the end of the Second World War, Japan has surrendered and the Allies have triumphed. Across Asia, the rising sun is being torn down, but not in Saigon. In a twist stranger than fiction, British officers rearmed the very Japanese troops they'd just defeated, ordering them back onto the streets to hold a city the Empire simply refused to let go of. As historian Phil Craig puts it, this is where victory met its reckoning. Today we'll be exploring 1945, The Reckoning, the final volume in Phil Craig's trilogy on the Second World War. Along the way, we'll ask a number of questions, including was 1945 truly a moment of liberation, or was it simply the start of new betrayals? What did it mean when British generals rearmed Japanese soldiers to hold colonies in Asia? And how did 1 year fracture families, topple empires, and shape the modern world that we live in today? This episode takes you deep into the reckoning at the end of the Second World War, where victory was simply the beginning. Why did you decide to frame it around a reckoning rather than a victory?
I think from the word go, I wanted to send a signal to any potential reader that this is a complicated story, maybe more complicated than you expect. I played with all sorts of titles. And I wanted to call it at one point something like Bitter Victory or Compromised Victory. But in the end, I thought reckoning was quite a good word because I'm trying to achieve a kind of balance in what I'm writing here. And, you know, I'm the sort of person, as I've got older, I've probably become quite conservative in many ways. I'm the sort of person who rolls his eyes and gets a bit annoyed when some academic says, we must pay massive reparations for slavery, or the British Empire was the worst force in human history. I don't really buy into that. And yet, there's so many things that happened, especially in the final year of war, that we're really not taught here. You were not taught these things, I don't think, when you did your GCSEs. And to really understand it, we need to look at it warts and all, and some of it's quite warty. And there were the parts of the story that I think would surprise people and maybe encourage them to give the book a chance. So that's why I went for reckoning rather than victory.
Now, I guess the central premise or one of the premises of your book is that the end of the Second World War in Europe, to a lot of degrees, actually precipitates new battles and new battlegrounds in Asia. And again, I think a lot of people's idea of World War II, especially those in Britain or in the West, is a very Western-centric viewpoint in terms of there's VE Day and then that's kind of the end of it. Like, there's peace again and we all move on. So I guess going to that warty history, how is the end of the war in Europe affecting things on the opposite side of the globe?
Well, I want to start answering that just by jumping to Asia, to Southeast Asia and the Pacific briefly, because here's something that many people in Britain don't really like to think about. When the Japanese first sweep through this region with incredible speed and success, the colonised people of the areas that they're conquering, that they're taking charge of, many of them experience a great feeling of pleasure. It's thrilling. It's thrilling that all of the Dutch and the French and the British and the Americans are being driven out by people who look a lot like them. And that was a kind of liberating moment in the imagination, I think, of many, many, many millions of people in the colonised world. And I think no matter how badly the Japanese behaved, and they did frequently behave very, very badly, in some respects they were a worse imperial oppressor than the British at their worst. But despite all of that, a genie was out of the bottle now. You know, people had seen you don't necessarily need white people running everything. Things can change. And so trying to put the genie back in the bottle was always going to be problematic. And that's what sort of starts to happen, sadly, in Europe after VE Day, when the French and the Dutch and others are putting their countries back together, especially the French, really wanting to grab the old colonial territories back. Churchill wanted to help them. Hence, a story in Vietnam that I consider completely shocking, which is the way in which we send a British army, well, mostly full of Indians, to fight with the French, to put the French back in charge and basically betray all sorts of promises we'd made to the allies that we'd had against the Japanese. I mean, it's one of the more shocking and surprising stories. And again, I don't think even 1% of people in Britain know that story, but you can bet 100% of people in Vietnam do. Yeah. And that's important, I think.
Your book centers around 5 compelling lives, and I guess fundamentally, why have you decided to pick those figures, and how do they help to, I guess, bring into focus some of the wider, more global events that are happening? How do they almost humanize the history rather than it feeling like this is just some grand narrative that's occurred at some point at some place in time, and for a lot of people it could just be complete fantasy? And I guess, how do these individuals in particular, I guess, embody what you're hoping to illustrate with this book?
Well, it's nice for you to say that you find that it's humanised. There's quite a lot of political and strategic stuff in the book, but I have a TV background. You know, I had a 40-year career in television, making often, you know, historical documentaries and documentaries about contemporary politics. And every producer will tell you that if you can engage someone with a human story, with a human face, with human emotion, you've already got them hooked. So you try to lead your storytelling with real people and follow them through the course of a particular storyline or narrative arc. And then you can kind of hang the analysis, the big thoughts on economics and imperialism and military strategy. You can hang that on them. And that's how I've written all my 3 World War II books. This is the 3rd in a trilogy. It took me 25 years to finish because of the TV career. And that's the style I use. I was really absolutely thrilled that James Holland, who wrote the foreword, who is probably the most successful writer of popular history in our country at the moment, he actually said that when he read my first book in 2000, called Finest Hour, he saw a way of writing that inspired him to write. And that makes me feel rather proud and also rather old. There you go. That is the way I do it. And sometimes you really are so lucky. I mean, for example, I'm sure we'll talk later about the nurse, who's one of the big characters in the book. She's a white British woman who finds herself in the middle of this extraordinary campaign in India, in Burma, and doing all sorts of amazing things. And she's a witness to history. So, for example, the Bengal famine is a really big and important story, and I really felt I had to tackle it. But I found a way of getting into it through what she witnessed when she sees people in such terrible situations. When she's got food, you know, the armies and the nurses have got food. But as they travel around the country, they see the desperate state of the poor people of Bengal, and that really touches her and moves her. And that's what kicks off my few sections on the famine. So that's just the kind of narrative style that I really enjoy. I enjoy reading it, and I enjoy writing it.
On a complete tangent, your career sounds amazing, and that's almost like a whole podcast in itself in terms of picking your brain about how you got into that and what you did. But I think I was reading obviously I was reading in preparation for this, and I can't remember the name of the Radio 4 history kind of documentary series that you worked on, but when I realized that you had worked on it, I was kind of like, oh my god, that's amazing. Because I used to listen to it all the time in the car on the way to school with my dad, and so yeah, it holds a particular kind of place in my memory, so to speak. Sorry, so coming back to the book.
Thank you.
No.
I've been very lucky, and you know, you get certainly in terms of World War II, because even though I make all sorts of criticisms, these books are kind of a love letter to that generation. And when I started them in 2000, you know, you couldn't meet people. I had a party in the garden just there in about 2001, and I had Spitfire aces, people who'd worked for Churchill, people rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk. I got to introduce them to my kids. I mean, that was amazing. Now, finishing this book, 2024, I think I met 2 people who are in it.
And they must be very, very old by now.
They are. Although, of course, in recent months, I've become quite friendly with this extraordinary guy. Through your friend Teshpal, I met Yavar Abbas, and I've spoken with him twice. No, 3 times, actually, we've spoken together in public. 104 years old. He lives about 5 bus stops away in Feltham.
It's incredible. It's just crazy.
Not only is he in, you know, he's in some of the stories that I write about, he knew really well this remarkable character, General Timmy. I should use proper Indian pronunciation. Forgive me if I butcher this. Kodandira Subaya Thibaya. He knew him. He played bridge with him. I mean, wow. So yeah, now and again you do get that amazing connection between the past and the present, which is what I think always thrills us with history. but of course a lot less than when I started. Anyway, yes. Well, thank you. I have been very lucky in my career, and I've got to meet all sorts of cool people.
Coming back to the book, I guess we were talking about how you shift between personal stories and high level decision making that's occurring in London, Washington, Tokyo, Berlin, all over the world. I guess as a writer and a historian who would have been reading through seams of evidence and all sorts of secondary and primary sources, how do you strike that balance between kind of conveying the narrative that you want to, but also humanizing it and getting that person's character across as well? Because you almost don't want to skimp out on either, because you'd almost it wouldn't quite work out in the way that it does. So yeah, how do you do that, and like how many revisions did you
Well,
make
I
to
mean,
your book?
one answer to the question is you have to be very brutal. And again, having a TV background helps, because any TV filmmaker will tell you you end up throwing so much away, and it sometimes breaks your heart. That's a month's work I've just cut out. That's a whole interview I've just dropped. But you have to, and James Holland said, and again, it was very lovely to hear him say it, that he felt that my books held a balance on what I call the ridge line between kind of human interest and analysis. And that's just, I guess, instinct. You do learn through TV. I think you have a sense in your own mind how long you can run with the story before you need to return to another one, how long you can be away from a story before the reader gets bored and forgets it. And that's just, where you just learn that, and you hope that, not everybody will see the world or be in sync with you in terms of storytelling rhythm, but, that's just how I like to do it. But I did throw a lot away. I mean, I think you mentioned there are 5 major characters in the book. I think I started with like 9. I mean, I threw great chunks of it away because I thought it's too complicated. There was already a lot going on. So I did drop quite a lot towards the end. But so be brutal.
No, fair enough. Would you ever consider the bits that you cut out almost turning that into a book?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe an article or two. I mean, there's a particular Canadian guy who intersects with what the British are doing as they get towards Belsen, who was a really fascinating character. And also, there was quite a lot of sort of, how can I put it? I put in a bit about Chips Channon. It's only a small section, just to represent the really kind of hardcore imperialist, selfish, the sort of British, officious, arrogant, and very racist that most people would have wanted to punch then and now. And I had quite a lot about him, but I actually boiled it down to just one big section because I thought, maybe too many pantomime villains.
Yes,
there's a great moment when he actually, when we talk about the Bengal famine, there's this scene where Channon, who is an absolutely unapologetic, is racially prejudiced, and he thinks that white people should run the world, and that's just the natural way that God wants us to be, and he's having this dinner at the Ritz or the Savoy in the middle of the war with Lindenthingau, the Viceroy of India.
Yeah.
The guy that was in charge during the famine, who did very little. And the idea of those men sort of stuffing their faces with rich food. And, like I say, I'm not a hardcore empire basher by any means, but moments like that make you think, crikey, that was bad. It needed to change.
No. And I guess that would be being polite about it, really. Talking about characters, I guess one thing that you have, well, I guess by alluding to it, you spoke about how the Japanese kind of run through Southeast Asia very quickly. And to a lot of people, they are a liberating force and they are a future of hope. Although, again, as you said, some of the crimes that the Japanese commit are absolutely horrendous, like Unit 731 and all of the just insane things that occur. One of those people who obviously takes some inspiration from the Japanese is Bose, and he works with them very closely, and I'm sure they get as far as invading Burma, which at that point is part of kind of what is India. So where I'm trying to go with this is, how do ideas of independence compete? So you've got people like Bose on one hand, who is kind of like, let's just topple the whole thing. Let's try and pull the empire down with the aid of a foreign country. And then at the same time, you've got people like you were talking about earlier, and I'm probably going to butcher his name as well, but Tamaya. And again, he's very much part of that system, so to speak, and he's very much, I will die for king and country. So, how are ideas of independence evolving in different ways depending on perhaps context or background or other influences? And in particular between those two characters, because I think a lot of people will associate with Bose, and also a lot of people will associate with the Indian soldier that fought in the British Army.
That's a great question, and I think that I thought more about this than anything else. I mean, I really, books about empire, a lot of it is about India and the Indian Army and its extraordinary contribution to victory over Japan. But it's also about the build-up psychologically and militarily towards independence. I knew I wanted to write about Bose. He's so very famous and so much loved and revered in modern India, and yet I think in Britain maybe not very well known at all. And I couldn't quite work out who I would kind of intercut him with, contrast him with. And then I came across this guy Thimmeya, known at the time and to history really as Colonel and then General Timmy. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was one of those things that it wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. It was the Indian Military Museum, I can't remember the name of it, in Delhi, has an amazing digital section. And there was this book that had been published in the 50s and it had been out of print, for all of my life. And they had all of it digitized, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I filled my book with it. And then I ended up getting in touch with his family. I mean, I WhatsApped with his grandson. And I really love this guy, Timmy. And he's so interesting because he's also a nationalist. Just like Bose, they were part of that generation. They both were born in very kind of, you say, high-class Indian families. One in Bengal, one in the south in Coorg. Their families were, well-to-do, well-educated Indians who served the Raj. That was their fate. Timmy went into the army. Bose was going to go into the civil service. They both get very political, and they become very, inspired by what Gandhi is saying and the Congress Party and so forth. Timmy joins the army. He's in very, this is not many years after Amritsar.
No.
He's in two minds. Sometimes he's given orders he doesn't like. He becomes friendly with the Nehrus. Motidal, is that the right pronunciation?
Motilal, yeah.
Father of the future Prime Minister. And they become very good friends. And when he's having doubts, Nehru says, we need men like you to climb the ladder, to become the future statesmen and architects of our future, which is coming. Independence is coming. We don't go off in a huff. Stay, build, learn. And he takes that so much to heart. Bose, of course, goes a different way. He's an incredibly famous politician. He runs the Congress Party. Had he stayed within constitutional politics, there's a very good chance he could have been the first Prime Minister of independent India. Very good chance. He's on the cover of Time magazine in 1938 as a man of the future. And he can talk the talk. He travels the world. He can be very moderate. Some of the things he says really do predict the Commonwealth of today. So there's a lot to like about him. He's very charismatic. But he's also messianic. He has a sense of himself as a prophet, and he sort of falls for the glamour of the dictators of that era. And I mean Stalin, I mean Hitler, I mean Mussolini, men of action who can change things in a hurry, and with a sort of paramilitary force around them. And it was very glamorous. And at the time, a lot of people thought, the world had gone wrong. What empires, global depression. We need a change. But he got into this in a big way. And when the time came and the war came, he escapes India very dramatically. And he finds his way to Berlin, where he hangs out with all the top Nazis. He socializes and is friends with people who, were in the room when they planned the Holocaust. He visits concentration camps. Some of his, because he has quite a left-wing background, he's challenged on this. And he says some amazing things. He says, whatever we might hear about what they're doing in the East, he means like what they're doing to the Jews in Poland and Ukraine. Whatever we hear, we must remember that we're not here to judge them. We're here to benefit from them. You know, we have a good cause. The independence of India is a great cause. We just need their help. So that's what he believed. Then, of course, he comes to Japan. He travels another dramatic journey, submarines, takes over the INA, supercharges it, and throws in his lot with the Japanese. Now, intercutting him with Timmy is great because Timmy's own brother joins the INA. It's a military family, right?
Yeah.
His own brother, they're very close, decides to follow Bose. So there's a chance Timmy and his own brother might kill each other, you know? So it's really hard for Timmy. And certainly the first year in the war, when everything's going terribly wrong, I'm sure he's tempted himself. But he doesn't trust Bose. He doesn't trust the Japanese. And Bose starts doing things that offend and annoy a lot of Indians. Like, for example, he goes to Nanking, where the Japanese carry out literally the worst atrocity maybe ever. I mean, one of the great killing sprees of all time. Japanese killing Chinese civilians in a sort of orgy of sexual sadism. It's disgusting. Anyway, he goes there and he makes a speech about pan-Asian values, about Asians looking out for Asians. And this is the future. Well, I mean, it's a nice sentiment, but to do it in Nanking.
Yeah, the backdrop is.
And of course,
not
the
the right
Japanese
place.
keep killing. You know, the Japanese are always killing Indian prisoners, and you know, and so when it finally comes to it, when the INA comes into combat with the Timmy's army, the official Indian army, Bose is convinced that all the Indians will desert the British, and he will march with them to Delhi, and that'll be it. But of course, it doesn't happen like that because. Well, I don't know why. There's lots of reasons. I think maybe one of it was a loyalty to the army itself, which does become an amazing institution. Biggest volunteer army in history. 2.5 million people. And it's very good. And another reason I think is that, you know, British propaganda is quite clever. Whenever the Japanese do something terrible, you bet the Indian soldiers are told about it.
Yeah.
But it's still quite remarkable when you think there's been the Bengal famine. There's been the awful racism on the evacuation of Burma, where the Indians were just left to die and all the white people got out. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it was a little bit like that.
Yeah.
So despite all of this, enough Indians like Timmy decided to stay loyal to the British. But I think by then it was clear, this is it. You know, this is it. The last one. And then we need to be free. But it's that intercut between Bose and Timmy is at the heart of the book, and I just find it really, really, you can probably tell the way I'm talking, very exciting, because you can get into big political ideas through two actually human beings and their struggles, and they're both really articulate. So you've got lots of material to work with.
So what, from your research, this is again a bit of a tangent, but what from your research do you know about what happened to Bose in the end? Because there's obviously kind of a debate about whether he's assassinated, whether it's an accident, whether he kills himself, whether he actually fakes his death. Like, there's all sorts of theories. And
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea how popular Bose was online with young Indians today. Not just Indians, but mostly. I mean, there is a real cult of Bose. And of course, the Prime Minister Modi is always speaking about him. He's the true hero of independence, according to Modi. There was a 10-part series Amazon Prime did. Have you seen it? All about the INA. It's called The Forgotten Army.
I don't think so, but I will go watch it now.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, it's full Bollywood production.
Drama. Yeah,
Very
yeah.
emotional. And in watching it, you think that Bose liberated India from the British. I mean,
It is interesting how these characters are recast.
well, nobody's making a show about Timmy, although I would argue he maybe did more for actual independence than Bose ever did. And a lot of Indian soldiers today would agree with me. Military historians would agree with me. But yeah, you asked me about his death. Part
Yes.
of the cult of Bose is like Elvis, like
Yes.
Hitler.
Yes.
There's he didn't really die. And actually,
Yeah.
Bose had a history of kind of fake of dramatic escapes. I mean, his escape from Calcutta to Berlin is one of the all-time great stories, with disguises and body doubles and goodness knows what. So what I think really happened is that he died in a plane crash in the final hours of the war, trying to get out on a Japanese plane. Why do I think that? Because the man who was travelling with him saw him die and wrote about it. So that's pretty solid evidence, I think. But no, a lot of people. He was possibly thinking of fleeing to Moscow. And some people think he faked his own death. They had just a pile of ash. It wasn't him. And a lot of people believed he lived for a long, long time. Some believe he went to South America. But I don't think he did. I think he died in a commoner garden plane crash. And actually, for his cause and for his legacy, he picked a very convenient time to die because it's so much easier to admire him dead.
Yes.
Than have to deal with the messy reality of a world with him in it. And not long after that, and this is another extraordinary thing that I think so surprised me, but maybe that's because I don't think like an Indian of that generation. Almost all of his lieutenants and many of his ordinary soldiers, when they get home to India, they're met with garlands and speeches, and they're seen as kind of flawed heroes, even by the Indian soldiers who had fought against them. They're just seen as men whose love for independence took them too far. And there's a real desire to rehabilitate them into public life and move on. It's a new world now. We're going to be independent. We need you guys. And that surprised me, but in a way, it's kind of a delightful story too, because it is true. I mean, the guy Dillon, who I quote from a lot, was one of his top lieutenants, Singh Dillon. He writes beautifully about his kind of bittersweet feelings about the British, how he hates being a rebel, but he sort of feels he has to be, but how he yearns to be back with his Indian brothers. And actually, he got that, did Dillon. So that kind of pleases me. I don't think INA was the right decision, but that's me as a 65-year-old white man saying it. At the time, I don't know what I would have done, but it was nice that in the end they were rehabilitated and reintegrated, because they always dreamt of independence, and then they got to benefit from it in the end.
The goal was the same, I guess. So once it's done, rather than, I guess, risking a civil war, it makes sense of their being included. Although I guess that's not their thinking.
By the time we get to 45, you've got Indians fighting Indians, and they both believe they're fighting for independence.
Yes.
Just choosing different routes.
Yeah, no, definitely. Coming back then to the nurse that you were talking about earlier, who is witnessing the Bengal famine. Her name's Angela Noblet. What, I guess, first of all, how did you come across her? Because it's just interesting how these people, first of all, how historians find the source material, but secondly, how did she find herself there to witness it in the first place?
Her story is brilliant. She's a young woman from Lancashire in her early 20s, has a kind of passion for adventure. She's a frustrated writer, trained as a nurse, gets offered the chance in, I forget when, 41, 42, to go to India. She has a very modern take on the world. I got her diary. From time to time, I sort of found myself thinking, did she really write this in the 1940s? She had a very kind of humane and tolerant view, and she got very cross when her white friends, when they get to India, start treating like the rickshaw drivers really badly. And she really believed that there was a better future for India ahead of them as an independent country. But she was another lucky one. I mean, I was looking, I wanted somebody to talk about the medical innovations, which were a big part of why the Indian Army was so brilliantly successful. And I think I saw a reference to her, and then I found that the War Museum had interviewed her at length and produced a pamphlet about 1983. And I found a copy, second-hand copy online, and it's upstairs. And again, now I'm in touch with, I think, 3 of her children.
Oh, wow.
And that's been a great joy. They came to the book launch, and that was fantastic. So I'm a little bit in love with her, which is weird because we never met. She's been dead 40-odd years, but she has such a wonderful spirit, and she does see terrible things. But she also, she's on like this ambulance ship, and she tries to treat Japanese prisoners, and they're terrified that they're going to get executed. And she's trying to stop these Gurkhas from killing them, because that's what the Gurkhas want to do. And, she falls in love. She goes to amazing balls. She meets important people. She's just a real presence in history. And she also has this lovely vision of a better future. And I think she captures the hope and the positivity of, a lot of that generation who I do say a lot of it became quite cynical at the level of politics, but think a lot of the ordinary white people in that army did believe that they were fighting for a better future, a world beyond empires, for a start. Certainly she believed in that. And actually British official propaganda, the pamphlets that all of the troops and the nurses read, it's surprisingly progressive. It's not we're fighting for God, King and Empire, like, say, the First World War. It's we're fighting for a future of self-determination, a world without tyranny, where people can choose how they wish to live and be governed. And certainly Angela represents that aspect of the character of the people of that time. Although, as I say in the book, there's a bit of backsliding, certainly in Southeast Asia, in the final months of the war, which I try to explain why that happened.
No, thank you. Yeah, sure. I did find her quite fascinating, considering she's there, she's witnessing it. And I think it's a quite refreshing way of looking at the famine, because a lot of the time the argument is just based around Churchill and his involvement or not his involvement. So coming at the famine from a completely unique kind of perspective in relation to basing it on her and what she witnesses is almost just completely it just obviously the involvement and whether the extent of the involvement is still part of the story, but it's not the main focus. And I think much of the literature is unfortunately kind of still stuck there. Moving on to then another character that you include, Douglas Brock Peterkin's notes from Belsen. I guess, first of all, what is so fascinating about those notes? And then secondly, what do they reveal about the complexity of liberating Belsen?
Well, I spoke about the hope and the positivity of that generation. I mean, I can't think of a better example than Peterkin. I did have a lot more about the war in Europe, and I kind of boiled it down because there's the real focus of this book is empire, and it is what's happening in the East. But I also wanted to show there's two sides to this, that Britain was powerful and able to do great things because it was an empire. Great things, certainly in the early years of the war, standing alone against Hitler, that's something I would never gainsay. And I think the liberation of Belsen, which is a story that is often told in terms of the horror of what is found there, all the dead bodies famously photographed. But the other story, the story of the medical relief operation, which is absolutely groundbreaking and is still studied today by people in famine relief and disease, treating epidemics. There's like 50 medics. They come across this unbelievable scene of horror, and they have to improvise, and they save tens of thousands of lives in the space of an amazing fortnight. And they bring in volunteers from medical schools, and they risk their own lives. Most of them actually get typhus as well. Typhus is the big killer. Well, famine and typhus. And Peterkin certainly catches typhus. So they all go in there knowing that that's going to happen. And it's a really brilliant story. I mean, you talk about the mechanics of liberation. They came across the very worst of what the Nazi regime was. And while they're there, the very final Luftwaffe attack in the West, literally hours before Hitler shoots himself, is about 5 planes that they've managed to patch together. And they attack the British relief camp at Belsen, like a final act of vindictive cruelty to their greatest victims, who are, of course, the Jews in that camp, mostly Jews, and the doctors who are trying to save them, stitch them back together again. It's an amazing story, and it was very touching for me because, and this is how I got onto him, he plays a small but important role in my family's life, because in the years after the war he saves the life of my father-in-law, so my wife wouldn't be alive because of him, and that's a small thing compared to the Holocaust, but it's like 2 stories, one touching me, one cosmic and massive and world changing,
Yes.
but it's all driven by the same man, and a man who had a real purpose to do good, and that's the positive side. It's a reckoning, the positive side of what Britain contributes, which is massive and needs to be taken into account alongside some of the darker stories I tell of broken promises and colonial backsliding and the empire dragging on for a few decades longer than we promised, which is what quite a lot of the final chapters of the book are about.
No, certainly. You also discussed the Australian Special Forces operation in Borneo that goes disastrously wrong. And this was interesting to read because, again, it was completely new to me. Number of questions. Why did it go wrong? What are they trying to achieve? And is that kind of a sign of imperial overreach? Was that whole kind of operation, I guess, definable in just those few words?
I mean, it's a small story, what happens in Borneo, compared to, say, what happens in Vietnam, where they put the French back and they set the region up for 30 more years of war. So it's a small story, but it was a very fresh story to me. So I really enjoyed researching it. And I think it just shows you how messy and complicated it was, and how sometimes the British, in this case the Australians and the British, deserve their reputation for abandoning allies and basically making promises that they can't or don't intend to keep. Long story short, they go into the interior of Borneo, they get the local tribes all fired up to work with them against the Japanese. They promise them protection when this big invasion from the Australian army is coming. They also pay them for human heads, which is another kind of like grotesque but fascinating twist, because it's a headhunting culture. Anyway, it stirs up this very nasty and probably unnecessary war. The Japanese come after them, kill lots and lots of them. The Australians, when they land, know nothing about it and refuse to help them, so that they break all their promises to the locals. It all turns into a massive political row, and then after the war it's revealed that it was operating to a colonial agenda, really. It was to prepare the way for the return of British control over some very valuable economic resources. And it sort of lied to the Americans, because it was MacArthur's part of the Pacific region. So MacArthur had to sign it off. So they basically lied to the Americans. But then the final twist, and this is what really makes it controversial in Australia, is that they chose to do this mission over another one, which was deprioritised. And that was a mission to save 2,500 men in a camp a few hundred miles away on the same island. The camp is called Sandakan. It's notorious. 2,500 men there. 6 survive. 6. All of the others are killed. And they know the killings are happening. And they have a plan to rescue them. The plan may have failed. And there's no guarantee it would have worked. But they chose to do this sort of botched colonial operation rather than the operation to save their mates. And this becomes public knowledge in the 40s in Australia, creates a massive row, but really it's been sort of conveniently forgotten about. And because it's special forces, very little of it's written down. And what was written down was pretty thoroughly cleaned up, because there's a great quote in the book by one of the officers involved, saying this directly to the Prime Minister of Australia, to the general in charge of the whole Australian army, that they are dealing with their documents to protect the necessary chicanery that they had to use. So basically, it's a kind of slightly rogue operation that doesn't even achieve its aims, creates carnage, lots and lots of suffering. Not for the special forces guys, almost all of them survive. It's the poor old locals who've trusted them who end up dying. And it's just a kind of microcosm, I think, of how complicated and messy things were, how agendas overlapped. And also what I call imperial muscle memory. People just think in terms of empire. I say people, I mean the people pulling the strings in London and maybe Canberra. They just grew up in a world where it was just natural that people who looked like me ran everything and would continue to run things, despite what the propaganda said about self-determination, despite what the Atlantic Charter had promised, a future, of self-determination. Despite all that, this muscle memory was in people. And it wasn't just in people like Churchill, it was in even the Labour government that comes in after him, which surprised me quite a lot.
As we've been talking, we've obviously spoken about how the Japanese take over Southeast Asia very quickly, and then obviously as the war goes on, they're eventually pushed back, and eventually that side of the war comes to an end, obviously with America dropping the nuclear bomb. Why then do Allied commanders make the choice to rearm Japanese POWs, particularly in Indochina? And I know as we've been talking, you've spoken about how there is this push to almost re-establish some of the colonial regimes that were there prior to the Japanese takeover. So what was the thinking behind doing that? Why in particular use Japanese POWs? And then what's the knock-on effect for future independence movements?
Oh, it's seismic. I mean, Vietnam is a great example of this, but it also happens in the Dutch East Indies, in what's now called Indonesia. There is this push to put the colonialists back, despite everything that we'd promised. In our official war aims, which started life with the Atlantic Charter. very clearly stated that we will have a future of self-determination. And Roosevelt, the American president, was a passionate anti-colonialist. And in fact, he had said many times, even in 1944, and this is all written up in people's diaries, he had said, there's no way we're letting those French son of bitches back because they've been particularly cruel. And he was a lifelong opponent. You know, he was really pushing Churchill to get out of India. He thought that these empires were bad. They held the world back. The future was a different path. So he was dead against the French coming back. But he dies. He dies at a very inconvenient time. And meanwhile, Churchill and de Gaulle, who's now running France after the liberation of Paris, they're all both diehard imperialists. And they don't see why they shouldn't get the territory back. I mean, in de Gaulle's case, it was a sense, you know, France has been humiliated, it's been occupied. He believed in the glory of France. So he wanted Algeria and other places, and especially Indochina. Churchill says, we'll help. So a French and British army is sent. Most of the British soldiers, of course, are Indian. And after a while, actually, the Congress Party, who was negotiating independence, or was about to, they stopped this, but initially they're all Indian. The Americans agree, which is amazing, but Roosevelt's dead, and Truman is now in charge, and he doesn't seem to care as much about the colonial stuff. But also America itself is changing. You know, America is becoming a new kind of empire. It's grabbed lots of territory off the Japanese, strategic bases. It doesn't want to give back, which it should do, according to the Atlantic Charter. So think the rules, and there's a Cold War coming. Everybody knows there's a big rivalry now between capitalism and communism. So that affects the way people think. But the key thing about Vietnam is that the Americans themselves had promised Ho Chi Minh that he could run the place, because he'd been their ally. And the local people on the ground, the Americans in the OSS, that's like the CIA, the OSS, had written these long documents saying, he's the guy, he's friendly to the West, he wants to be our ally, he's very popular, he gets things done, let's go with him. All those documents actually disappear for a long time, but they were found many years later. But anyway, nothing happens. So he declares independence. The OSS are there. There's some great photographs. The OSS help him draft. The Americans help Ho Chi Minh draft the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam. And the opening paragraph is a quote from the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that men are created equal, blah, 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 life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All of that stuff. But suddenly there's this army turns up, British and French. Truman's not taking Ho Chi Minh's calls. It all kicks off. Ho Chi Minh's popular. The fighting is difficult. The British say, well, we need more supplies. We haven't got any more supplies. The Indians don't want to send any more men. Oh, well, there's a lot of Japanese sitting around in prison camps. And now we're talking only about 6 weeks after the end of the war. And during this time, the world is astonished to discover some of the horrors. You mentioned the germ warfare lab. But, you know, the death railways, the terrible, all the emaciated survivors of these Japanese camps are coming home. Indian, British, Australian, telling stories of how they've been mistreated. But 30,000 Japanese prisoners of war are released. Some of them may have done those atrocities. I mean, they'd been our enemies about a fortnight before, and Ho Chi Minh had been our ally. But suddenly, you've got Japanese soldiers under British command fighting against Ho Chi Minh. And you ask for the long-term impact of that. I mean, my God. So I can say Ho Chi Minh really wanted to be friends with the West. He's absolutely stunned and shocked that this could happen. He writes letters to everybody, nobody replies. And it sets the region up for, well, in the 50s, the war with the French against the Vietnamese, and then the Americans get involved, and then the Australians get involved. How many millions of Vietnamese die, nobody knows. Agent Orange, all of that horror. And at the end of it, by about 1975, who's in charge? Ho Chi Minh, the guy the Americans wanted to be in charge 30 years earlier. So it's one of history's most terrible mistakes. I mean, absolutely shocking. And like I say, these documents that were written in 45, I think I discovered, I forget which newspaper, maybe the Washington Post or one of those papers. And they well, hang on a minute, why are we fighting this war when our own specialists, not many decades ago, said this is our ally? we should work with him. And the only answer to that, I'm afraid, I think is, well, Truman not caring, but mostly decisions made in Paris and London by men who just wanted the age of empire to go on for another few decades, because they were the men they were. They saw the world the way they did. And they wanted the money from colonies, but I think in terms of de Gaulle, it was more the glory, the pride. You know, our flag, the French flag, around the world, and it's an all-time strategic and moral disaster, I think, what happened in Vietnam in 1945. And again, a story that is very, very little known. Something similar happens in Indonesia, except in that case it doesn't really work. There's more people killed, massive battles, which are very much remembered in Indonesia today. The Battle of Surabaya is the biggest urban battle the British Army has fought since the Second World War. The place ends up looking like Gaza or Aleppo. It's smashed to bits. But it kind of doesn't work because within a couple of years it's obvious that the Indonesian people are never going to accept the Dutch, and so they go. But in Vietnam it did work. And that's 30 more years of misery. So yeah, like I say, there's quite a lot of anti-imperial stuff in this book, which I try to balance with other things, because history's messy. Yes. I guess that's one of the big messages of the book. It's very hard to boil it down into a tweet or a TikTok.
I guess we've been talking and you've mentioned kind of imperial muscle memory, and you've already alluded to how at the point where the war is kind of coming to a close, things like the Atlantic Charter exist, but yet there's these attempts to re-establish colonial rule. So I guess, how does 1945 reveal the gap between wartime promises, such as the Atlantic Charter or independence or some form of self-determination or whatever else it may be, with the actual kind of colonial realities that start to erupt in certain areas? So for argument's sake, as we've already said, Indonesia or Vietnam. And also, what are people on the ground thinking after, for argument's sake, I don't know, Britain has turned around and said, we will do X, Y, and Z if you cooperate, and then when it actually comes to it, all of a sudden, Truman's not taking Ho Chi Minh's cause, for instance.
I mean, we haven't mentioned Malaya, have we? That was perhaps the most profitable British colony that they were desperate to get back, despite the fact that prior to 45 there had been lots of talks about independence. That leads to an emergency, they call it the emergency, a kind of civil war. I think one thing I was surprised by is just how much money came out of the colonies in the decade after the Second World War. Certainly, you could argue that Britain's great achievement was building, slum clearance and new estates and the NHS. An awful lot of that was paid for by money from Malaysia, from what's now called Malaysia. The Malaysian rubber industry was like the world's biggest, certainly was Britain's biggest foreign currency earner in the 50s. I think what you learn from this is that when it comes to it, and when nobody's stopping them, governments of all parties will take the line of least resistance to what will bring them the most income, even if that means breaking promises. And I think that's very much what the British did across the region. I mean, India was a special case. It would have been impossible to hold on to it. I think everybody had agreed independence was inevitable and the right thing to do. I mean, you can argue about how it was handled, of course, but the other thing is that it was a racialized world. People, I mentioned Attlee, and the audiobook of this book was narrated by an actor, a British actor, called Richard Attlee, and he's Clement Attlee's grandson, Britain's 1945 Labour Prime Minister, another person who was a lifelong opponent of empire. But once he gets into power and looks at the books, he changes his mind. And they do talk about, yes, liberal, progressive, evolution, but it's just pushing it into the middle distance while the money keeps coming in. And there's one very telling phrase that Attlee uses when he talks about the future of Southeast Asia. He says, well, it's maybe not for us to govern these places, but maybe we could involve the Scandinavians. They're every bit as well equipped to rule as we are. What an extraordinary thing for a Labour politician to say. What could he possibly have meant except, well, they're white, like us. So naturally, they could do a good job governing a country rather than, I don't know, the people that live there. So it's a racialized world. You know, we don't like to acknowledge it. We like to think of ourselves as a heroic underdog in the Second World War, another theme of the book. The British do love that idea, and, you know, maybe in 1940 we were, but the rest of the world never saw Britain as an underdog because Britain had run half the world. And if anything, we were an overdog. And that had got into our, even socialists like Ackley, I think, saw the world in that way. There was something natural about Europeans kind of telling other people what to do. And, you know, yes, they said, oh, in the future, soon, there'll be a big conference. The Queen's going to do a visit. You know, we'll have a... But they were just still just saying, you know, how much money can we get out of Malaya next year? And it was a lot.
Your book travels from India to Germany through Southeast Asia and almost probably, I'd say, a huge amount of the world map. What is the challenge in connecting such varied theatres under one narrative? And how did you, I guess, deal with weaving and connecting sometimes geographically quite distant stories?
Well, I guess I have to just go back to what I said about the ridgeline. You know, you have to have a sense of how much the reader can take before you need to remind them about the story A, before you get to story B and story C. That's just instinct. I mean, I did cut a lot out because it was getting a bit complicated. I think it works. You know, you tell me whether you found it confusing or not. It's hard to sometimes know how to pitch these things. Will somebody bring much knowledge to the table, or are you writing for somebody with no knowledge?
Yeah.
I guess it's just the experience you have as a storyteller through books and telly, and you put it out there and say, "Well, I hope you like it. I hope it makes some sense." You know, there is no secret formula. It's just instinct, and you can learn it, I think.
If 1945 was a reckoning, as the title states, what do we need to do today then to reckon with, for argument's sake, like historical memory, imperial legacy, or even modern geopolitics? Because a lot of the conflicts and genocides and some of the kind of world events that we are witnessing or have witnessed in the last 60, 70 years have, like, for argument's sake, the Vietnam War has direct correlation back to the end of the Second World War. The partition of India, obviously the independence that occurs, that's post kind of Britain running out of money. Then what happens in Greece when the communists rise up post the Second World War, Britain's like, we've got no cash left, so the Americans step in, and that helps lead them into basically the world today where America is the kind of global superpower. So I know that's a huge question, and there is a lot going on in the world currently too, but I guess in a few minutes or sentences, how do we try and reckon with memory, imperial history, geopolitics, and kind of some of those warty and thorny issues?
Yes, warts and all. Well, there are plenty of them in the world today, as we know. You know, it's funny, when I saw Trump and Putin recently, it does make you think of those big three conferences at the end of the Second World War. And that time when people, powerful men, it's always men, sit in a room with a ruler and a pen and a map. And the people who live in these places, they're secondary importance. You know, the Ukrainians aren't even invited, it would seem. And maybe now and again in history, those things are necessary to end great wars. Perhaps they are, but you have to think, if there's one lesson from the end of the Second World War, it's do listen to the people on the ground. If they had really listened to the Vietnamese, they would never have gone back in 45, and the world would have been spared a lot of pain. You know, and I think you could apply some of that analysis to what happened in Africa in the 60s, maybe Malaya too. I do think there's a danger that, you know, and I think maybe the Chinese as well are part of this, you know, carving the world up between great powers. It seems to be back in fashion, and I don't think it should be. You know, a lot of people went to a lot of trouble to create institutions where everybody had a voice. It didn't always work, but it's a good and noble ambition. And I fear that, you know, obviously Trump's elected, but there's a sense that we're entering an age of, you know, not an age of dictators, maybe an age of 2.5 dictators. And I don't know what the long-term consequences of that will be. If it brings peace to Ukraine, despite the pain of giving up territory, maybe it has to happen, I don't know, but it worries me. It worries me that, once again, what the local people in a place actually want is secondary to the big players and whatever massive deals they're doing about money. And also, I think, pride. I mean, yeah, maybe, say de Gaulle was influenced by a sense of glory and wanting to restore French pride. Well, what's driving Putin? Ever since the Cold War, he wants Russia back, doesn't he? He can't bear to think they lost all that territory. Ukraine just is psychologically part of Russia in his mind, as perhaps Vietnam was a part of France to de Gaulle. So yeah, maybe we haven't changed that much after all. Oh dear, that's rather a downbeat ending, isn't it?
If that is the endings, I guess that's just history repeating itself again, to use another cliche to kind of wrap up. I guess one thing I want to ask before we do wrap up is there anything that you think we haven't mentioned or you wish to include, or anything from the book that you wish people listening take away, or anything?
Only to say that actually I've made it sound very, very serious, and actually there's lots of colour and love and courage and sentimentality and a really good joke about diarrhea. You don't get that in every book.
Well, I hope those listening to this, if you have read that joke, obviously comment below and let us know. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been you've been more than patient with me, because we've been trying to organise this for absolutely forever, and it's been an absolute pleasure to
Oh no,
host
I'm very,
you.
very touched, and thank you for your time as well. It's
No, not a
I
problem.
really appreciate the platform.
No, not a problem. Thank you for coming on.
Awesome, thanks so much.